So now welcome to the first CCGGC. That is the County Club Guildford Grill Club. We had a little, I was going to say dry run back in the autumn, but I don't remember it being very dry at all. I went to bed at 3:15 the next morning. But we certainly practised our eating, and we had a little bit of drinking. And basically we had a feast of fodder, which we're going to have today, and have already enjoyed. We had a bevy of booze, which we've already done today, and we've had some nimble nattering. But now we are going to indulge in gluttonous gorging with our grill guest, David Starkey.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we're going to start with a question from Jonathan Tippett, which is number 1. And as there we are, David, so that you have got a copy of it as Jonathan asked it. Jonathan.
Number 1, as a pioneer, I'll stand up because I can't see you, David, otherwise. My first question, it's a bit of a technical one to a historian, because I couldn't answer it. Is Richard III buried in the right place, or should he have stayed in the car park?
My view is absolutely, and I said this not in front of the Guildford Grill Club, but actually in front of the assembled dignitaries who all descended from the combatants at the Battle of Bosworth, that absolutely he should have stayed in the car park. First of all, I am deeply unpersuaded that what we buried with such preposterous solemnity were actually the bones of Richard III. If you remember, the extraordinary woman who, by psychic process, guessed that under the K in Park King we would find a king, first of all, I think is deranged. And I mean that seriously. And secondly, the DNA analysis, well, everybody is descended from Edward III. Simply I mean, quite seriously, everybody is descended from Edward III, if you actually look back at the number of people alive then and the number of people alive now. So that's the sort of crude version of it. The second point I would like to make is the sheer preposterousness of the entire ceremony of reburial. Does anybody remember it? You had John Snow of Channel News, who, when the word royalty is normally mentioned, sort of vomits and changes his tie even before he's vomited, doing a kind of not a David Dimbleby, a Richard Dimbleby of prostration. Only Channel 4 would have taken the reburial of this king, this whatever he was, more seriously than a current royal event. So there was I was commentating on it from York, and it was just the absurdity of the thing, the kind of neo-Diana-esque, and that was all fairly silly anyway, the neo-Diana-esque keening and whatever around him. And finally, Richard III seems to me to be, there's much competition, but the worst monarch that's ever sat on the English throne. I mean, again, you see, people do divide. There are those who were sane, and there were those who were members of the Richard III Society. And anybody who is a member of the Richard III Society, by definition, is demented. If there are, rather a lot of them. One of the good things about them is they've got quite deep pockets, and they actually finance serious historical research. So the Richard III Society pays for really good historical research, but they are fundamentally mad. If you actually think about it, Richard III cuts his way to through blood to the throne, and managed to hold it for less than 2 years. Now, the thought that a king survives for less than 2 years and then is brought down by as an implausible acclaimant as Henry, Earl of Richmond, Henry VII. Remember, Henry VII has, if you could measure royal blood in terms of pipettes, rather like COVID measurement, it's about 1/100th of 1 millimetre of real royal blood in his veins. And the fact that somebody as implausible as that could defeat Richard III demonstrates that he really should have remained in the car park, decently there, and the whole absurd, again, one of the problems is when you try to redo history, when you try to reverse the verdict of history, you almost always get it wrong. And particularly when you sentimentalize. Sentiment, false feeling, is the worst guide to actual human action. And the whole Richard III business exemplifies that. I've spent much too much time on somebody who doesn't deserve it. I don't mean your question, I mean on Richard III, yeah.
And the demented supporters.
And the demented supporters of Richard III, yeah.
Now, let's move on, David, to question 2, which I'm sure you'll find some eloquent words on as well. Question 2 comes from Paul. Where are you, Paul?
I'm here.
He's here.
I'll stand up as well. The number of this question, well, I'm going to read it as it is. Should Liz Jolly be imposed as Chief Librarian of the British Library when she spouts such nonsensical statements as racism is a construct of white people? And there's a sort of an addition there. Has she not heard of places like Africa, Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, Asia?
No room for any control, Senior.
No, but there's room for a great deal of seriousness. Many of you here will be familiar with the events that touched me in the summer of 2020. The British Library decided that my scholarly introduction in a field which I had pioneered, in an essay which redefined that field for the relationships between England and Scotland in the middle of the 16th century, should be excised from the catalogue of its forthcoming exhibition, because I had ventured to stray and misstray in the whole business of the appropriate language when we deal with those of colour. In other words, the British Library is supposed to be an institution that is the centre of scholarship, that is the centre of our archives, that is the centre of, if you like, the memory of the United Kingdom, the memory of Britain. It is run by people who are simply, whatever the word we want to use, race relations fanatics. I'm sorry, it really is true. It's a remarkable story. You have the actual CEO. You've got your names wrong. The CEO of the British Library is a man called Roller Keating, who was the, I'd be interested, you'll tell me later why you know so much about it, who was I think he was the, was he director of BBC Two? I think he was in charge of BBC Two. His background is within the BBC. Because he actually knew nothing about librarianship, so God only knows why he's appointed in charge of the British Library, you then appoint a chief librarian, who is this woman that you talk about here, Liz Jolly, who came, I think, from the University of Hull. Is Hull really regarded as being the next step in promotion to the directorship of the British Library? But the problem is, the British Library is now run. Again, let us talk here completely, frankly, and honestly. The British Library is run by the fetchers and carriers of books. It is run by a trade union, and it is run by the believers in critical race theory. You are paying for it. You are paying for the deliberate censorship, the deliberate misrepresentation, and the deliberate falsification of the central cultural record of this country, is what you are doing. And it is time you stopped.
So how would we stop that?
What you do is you write to your MP. Paul here clearly is well informed. Can you tell me why you've asked this question? Because I'm fascinated.
Well, basically because it was the shallowness of her thought.
Yeah, but how did you encounter? I mean, can anybody else in this room put up their hands and say, are they familiar with Liz Jolly as Chief Librarian of the British Library? Well, it's a very unusual thing for somebody to be aware of.
I'm from the University of Essex, so...
So you have experienced all of this.
I had, yes, a long, long time ago. And it was just the shallowness of the thought that actually hit me in the face when she said this.
But sorry, she is a believer. Can we not all please understand this? The civil service, the national health, and the universities have been taken over by this preposterous doctrine of critical race theory, which says that everybody in this room, because you are white, is fundamentally a wicked oppressor, that you should be ashamed of your history, and that effectively you are a blot upon the planet. Now, you may have actually noticed, can we all just step back from this question and generalize? You may have actually noticed when it has come to the reaction in the Ukraine, I said every question would relate to the Ukraine, whether it did or not, because it's necessary. If you actually look at the reaction to the Ukraine, the only countries that have been absolutely clear about what they should do is what used to be called the old white Commonwealth. It is the Anglosphere, it is Britain, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. The EU has merely been a rather defaulting, hesitant, and by the way, if you're German, making Volkswagen cars is much more important than cutting off gas supplies, right? It's been that. So how is it that this wicked, disgraceful inheritance of whiteness is the only thing that defends liberty? I'm sorry, we have really, really tough questions to ask ourselves and to answer. We've had a lovely lunch, and it's all nicely frivolous, but it's not. We're suddenly confronting real things which my generation and succeeding ones have deliberately refused to confront. What's going on in our universities, what's going on in our... It's throughout the entire national structure, the entire structure of the national bureaucracy. The ruling from the Equal Opportunities Commission that trans people can be excluded from female-only spaces. If you look at it, you see why. This woman has got, or whatever she is, has got extraordinarily bright pink hair, which is a kind of, I think, generic indication of what goes on inside the skull that wears this stuff. No, really, I'm sorry, you're all nice people, you're far too quiet.
You haven't answered the original question, David. Should she stay in post? I think you're saying no, but you also seem to put a great deal of faith into writing to MPs. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a great deal of faith in writing to
But then what else do we do apart from, again...
That's the question. What do we do? How do we answer your question?
I really do, I think that you have to write en masse. I really... Starmer could not even distinguish between a man and a woman. When you look at him, it's not surprising. But he couldn't distinguish between a man and a woman. This sort of stuff, remember, this entire rhetoric has become, it runs like a stick of rock through every established institution. The only way it can be broken is by the same kind of rebellion that happened over Brexit. Because, again, if you actually... Sorry, can we all just look at this? The lines of division are absolutely clear. Did not most of you notice that the line between those who supported Brexit and the line of those who were absolutely in favour of complete lockdown, permanent lockdown, that until the last case of COVID has been eliminated, nobody should ever be allowed outside their house, is exactly the same as those who were passionately in favour of remaining. There's an extraordinary close relationship. And broadly, it seems to me, the line of divide is between the bureaucratic, the professional class, and the rest. If you actually look at George Orwell, who is the infallible guide on all of these matters, Orwell says that if you look at 1984, which, I'm sorry, I really do think 1984 is the prophetic text for where we are now. He's not prophetic about the actual nature of our politics, but he's prophetic about geopolitics. He's prophetic about Oceania, which is, he says, the fusion of the British Empire and the United States of America, about Eurasia, which is Europe with its sort of concertina-like frontier in the continent of Europe, about East Asia, the Greater China and whatever. But what Orwell is absolutely brilliant about is putting his finger on where the fifth column lies. Because we do have a fifth column. The extraordinary way in which we lurched in the beginnings of COVID into what were essentially Chinese solutions. Lockdown is a Chinese solution to a Chinese virus and should never have happened. And if you look, what was extraordinary about that, there was no opposition. The media just clamoured for more. Lockdown. Yeah. The Labour Party just clamoured for more.
But you're saying they would have done that because they were what they are. The question then becomes, surely, if we need somebody to do what was done in Brexit, is that you? Are you the person
I couldn't possibly comment, I think is the phrase. But no, we need... Sorry, we need... It needs you're absolutely right. I mean, Jonathan Sumption stood up. Farage has done so to a certain extent, I suppose. OK, I'll be honest. I'm trying to do something similar.
But you've travelled a journey through life that a lot of people won't have travelled. In fact, they've sort of stayed in wherever they were. You're not exactly shy and retiring. So, are you not the person to lead this crusade?
How could I? I certainly think that we need desperately somebody who can formulate ideas. We need somebody who's got a command of language. We need somebody who has courage. I'm suddenly overcome. I'm overcome by shyness. I shall start lisping any moment. But sorry, David. Forget that for one moment. Can I just repeat what I've said? I am being desperately serious. What's going on in the Ukraine now shows that we are really at a kind of war. We have lived in a fool's paradise since the end of the Second World War. A fool's paradise that was reinforced in 1989. It's time we stopped. Really? Sorry. We're all comfortable people. And I had a wonderful conversation coming here from the station with a Pakistani taxi driver, and who was very literate, very intelligent. And we got talking about how lucky we were in Britain. The last time in England, well, not so much Scotland, that's another benighted. Scotland, it is another country. It's had civil war until the 18th century, right? Let's get this absolutely right. And it is heading straight to civil war now, it seems to me. But the last time there were scenes in England like the scenes in the Ukraine is in the middle of the 17th century. Nothing to do with us. It's to do with the intelligence, the foresight, and the adaptability of our ancestors. We have enjoyed fixity of frontiers. Ukraine's got no frontiers. We've got institutions that are 700-800 years old. Russia has no institutions of government. Russia has never known law, in our sense of the word. We have. And we've forgotten how precious, how valuable, and dare I say it, how unique these things are.
Very true. And that leads us into our next little set of questions. So we're going to start we've got three ABCs.
Okay, right.
They all run together, David. So we've got Alex with number 3.
That's me.
I will stand next to the lovely Anne with her pink hair.
Oh, I'm so... But it's not the right colour of pink. It's not... No. That's rather sweet and strawberry-like. This was flagrant, what I was talking. Flagrant. A new phrase, flagrant pink. Flagrant pink. Flagrant pink.
Yeah, you've been working for the Crown. No, Farrow and Ball.
Farrow and Ball, yeah. Flagrant pink, yes. Ointment, if you remember. Ointment, yes.
Now, the question is... You've begun to answer already, I think, but from a historical perspective, and I say this as a Catholic and as a Catholic priest, thinking about the Reformation, where being a Catholic was to be a non-person in this land, and I also believe people don't change very much. But so from a historical perspective, how do you see society moving forward from this insidious council culture which we are in and you have suffered from?
Before we get to that, let's take Jackie, who is 3A.
History seems to some to be only learning about dead people. It is also a Marmite subject, especially in schools, and I speak as an ex-history teacher here. While we might say we can learn from the past, there seems to be little evidence of that today. Particularly what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. How can we convince the sceptics that it's a subject worth studying?
And then finally, we've got Matthew over here.
Yes, that's right.
I know, Fitzwilliam Ty. Yes. Garlic, please. Yes. This was the college that spat me out, in Putin's phrase. Yes.
Do you consider the woke generation to be a threat to history?
Right. Thank you. I think these are all completely appropriate.
That's why we chose.
No. I think the grouping of them works really well. Again, if we go back to George Orwell, the whole point, or one of the central points of Brave New World, it's also Brave New World, but of 1984. One of the central points of 1984 is that the most dangerous challenge to totalitarianism is history, and a sense of the past, and a sense of rootedness, and a sense of the past in that wonderful phrase of A.P. Hartley about a country where they do things differently. Right. And my own view is, I'll deal with the questions disparately, if I may. It's complex of ideas, and I think the simplest thing is if I try to expand them, and they will touch sometimes on one answer, sometimes on the other. It seems to me, and again, you referred to my journey. I'm a born-again conservative. I was not a conservative. I wasn't raised as one. In the days of, I suppose, my maximal fame in the 1990s with the moral maze, I would have identified myself as a libertarian, which is something very, very different from a conservative. I've become forced to reconsider my positions because I'm still, again, my ideas are not fully coherent, they're not fully developed. I've come to the conclusion that the real problem that we face is that liberalism, which most of us, I think, would instinctively espouse, is finally self-destructive. There is no reason for liberalism to stop. Once you set up the notion that the individual is the absolute determinant of everything, there is no reason to stop. In the same way, the liberalism of the late 18th century finished naturally on the scaffold with the revolutionary terror of France, the liberalization of the 1960s finishes up naturally with the cancel culture. I'm sorry, and Orwell understood this. That's exactly what he's saying. Now, this is a very difficult proposition. It's a particularly difficult proposition for me and you, Father Hill, in the sense I am gay. And I'm an immense beneficiary of some aspects of that liberal culture of the 1960s. But it has now got to the point where it is self-destructive and self-consuming. And I suppose, cynic that I am, there is an immense pleasure in watching, you know, Philip Pullman and J.K. Rowling, who were the leaders of, you know, wicked Tories and all the rest of it. Suddenly, as always, the revolution consuming its own children and rending them apart. But what's the alternative? You presumably, for example, and we're seeing this, sorry, this is not just a problem here in Guildford, it's a problem of the world. And the last election, the results of which were announced only last night in Hungary, is absolutely about this. And what you see Viktor Orban trying to do in Hungary is to say, essentially, or indeed the equivalent party in Poland, is to say that a kind of rootedness in traditional family and traditional religion is the proper response. I don't think that can work. My view is different, and that we are uniquely well provided to do this in England or Britain. God knows whether Britain survives, England certainly will. Our own history in England offers us a unique reconciliation. Look, just think, there's a war of statues going on at the moment, which says only people who are moral by today's standards should still have their statues. Shall we just stand with our backs to the National Gallery in London, in Trafalgar Square, and contemplate what we see? What we see is this. On our right hand, there is a statue of James II, whose dethroning and driving out of the country in 1688-89, first of all, establishes the final rule that a monarch must not, forgive me, be a Roman Catholic, but equally is the beginning of a notion of modern parliamentary politics. 3 squares along, so we've actually still got a statue to him, a very beautiful one by Inigo Jones, I think it is, actually standing this. Very, very lovely statue. 3 squares along, if you get to St. James's Square, you have a magnificent, florid, early 18th century Baroque statue of, by, of course, somebody who comes from the Netherlands, but anglicizes, a wonderful statue of the man who overthrew him, William III. So we have the man who's overthrown and the man who overthrew him equally commemorated. If we look straight ahead, we've now turned to the right. Let's turn ahead. Let's look down to the bottom of Trafalgar Square. You see James II's father. You see Charles I, who is, of course, the only king publicly executed. Many have been done in, but he was the only one who was publicly executed in Whitehall, in front of the great banqueting house, which his father had begun and he had finished off and whatever. So you've got Charles I executed, the king executed as the symbol of the destruction of the English monarchy in 1649. And at the very end of Whitehall, as you turn the corner to the front of the Palace of Westminster, you have the statue of the man who was responsible for it, Oliver Cromwell. So we are able, and this seems to me to be absolutely fundamental, we are, and shifting now from George Orwell to T.S. Eliot, Eliot's Little Gidding seems to me to be the most extraordinary statement of the view of history that I'm talking about now, in which he says that we are the heirs of the victors and the vanquished. We are the heirs of the slavers and the slaves, of the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, of the Roundheads and the Royalists. And it is this, again, our monarchy is semi-republican. We are a republic. England is essentially it's a crowned republic. And this is the uniqueness of our legacy. It's why we look now very much stronger than America, which is the United States, which is beginning to disintegrate under the pressures of having taken the Enlightenment doctrines of universalism on the one hand, in terms of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence on the one hand, and on the other, having retained English law, slavery, and everything else, which means, of course, that's the only reason that the American Revolution is successful. The American Revolution is the only successful revolution because it's not a revolution. If you look, every other revolution has been a catastrophe. The most catastrophic event in human history is the French Revolution. France is, I mean, why are you having a debate between Macron, God's sake, a kind of parody Napoleon come Louis XIV, you know, against Le Pen? It's appalling. But it's history. This is where it comes absolutely to the central point. It is our history. It is that numinous, sorry, again, I'm sorry. I have no numinous sense religiously. I have a numinous sense historically. Guildford, okay, you can laugh at Guildford. It's in many. Why would you laugh? No, well, let me produce the line because it is really very, very good. If you look at one of the great mystical poems about England, is the Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, the great Arthurian poem. And what's remarkable about Malory's vision of Arthur is that you begin with all of these wonderful fictive place names like Camelot, and then you place them increasingly in the real England of the 15th century. So Camelot, well, first it becomes Winchester. That's sort of all right, because there's a round table in Winchester. Then it becomes Westminster. But the real lovely one, as far as Guildford is concerned, is, have you all heard of the Lady of Shalott? The wonderful Tennyson poem. She floats along the river with water reeds and weeds about her head, and this song dying and whatever. Anyway, so you get all the Lady of Shalott in forgive me giggling, in Malory. And then he puts in this note, Shalott, which we now call Guildford. You know, it really does take the romance out, doesn't it? But it is this sense of history under your feet, and not simply under your feet, around you, shaping you, limiting you. The great statement about the nature of politics and political obligation is that of Edmund Burke, in which he takes that late 18th century view of contract and says, if there is a contract, it's not between just those of us around now, it's a contract between the living, the dead, and the yet to be born. And this is the key. We are institutions. Institutions, be it the Catholic Church, be it the county club, be it my college, which is bitterly repudiating the fact, should go on across generations. So the present cannot simply repudiate the past. It is the heir and the beneficiary of the past. And we have to acknowledge that.
If we do cancel for whatever reason, are we not taking away something which future generations should be learning from?
Oh, absolutely.
So we don't make the same mistake.
Well, it's not so much it's not the business of making mistakes. It's a recognition of humanity. See, the great problem with the whole cancel culture and whatever is the assumption that we are unique, that we are uniquely virtuous, that we've been endowed with an understanding of the direction of history, that, you know, we're Tony Blair the year one. We are actually absolutely none of those things. We are products of history. Again, you know, the worst book ever written is Rousseau. All bad ideas are French. It's an absolute I'm being deadly serious. It's a universal definition. All bad ideas are French. And the opening of Rousseau, you know, men are born in chains, but, you know, should be born equal and whatever, is preposterous. We're not born free. Every woman here will tell you how you're born. You're born, as is wonderfully put by St. Augustine, and you will forgive me, it's the end of lunch. You're born amidst piss and shit. You're vulnerable. You're dependent. You depend on your parents. You're created by society. You're not an autonomous creature. And what we have to do is we don't invent our own ideas. Our ideas are inherited and conditioned. And this simply is not explained. The whole notion, the constant telling of children that they're autonomous, they're not. It's silly. We're repeatedly silly in what we do. And it is the problem. Liberalism is in some ways, quite noble, but because it so fundamentally ignores the facts of human nature.
Would a scientist agree?
Pardon?
Would a scientist agree with you? Room for discovery and invention?
Of course. So don't get me wrong. I see. You see, you're making the very excellent question, but you're making the common error that if I talk about the past, I'm. No.
You've obviously got several here, then.
Well, poor man to be isolated amongst your friends, but there we are. Let me try to help you. Let me try to give you a way by which you can extend a hand to them. The past is not a straitjacket. The past, on the contrary, is a fertile soil. If you go right back to the beginning of our culture, because remember, English is a very, very recent language. English only begins at the end of the 14th century. It's only 1300 and odd, right? And you look at Chaucer. There is this extraordinary two couplets in Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls. When he's been in Italy, he's familiar with the discoveries of classical literature and all the rest of it. And he comments as follows: that as the corn springs from the old soil, new every year, so new ideas spring from old books. The past is not a straitjacket. It's a humus. It's a fertilized soil from which things come. And I'm not some sort of rigid conservative. My own work historically was within its own tiny field, was revolutionary. Again, you see, I think the great straitjacket is imagining that the ideas of the present are universal. They're not. It results in, I remember vividly my terrible experience of trying to school teach on Jamie's Dream School. We had some awful brat who explained because he believed in racial equality, he was superior to St. Thomas More. You gently to explain to this lad who could barely articulate 3 short words in English that More was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, English, and had at his fingertips the entire resources of classical, medieval, and early modern culture, and that, frankly, he was a garden gnome. It's true. It really is true. So the past is fertilizing. If you want to look at all great science, after all, it's the great scientist, it's Newton, who says he's seen further because he stood on the shoulders of giants. Science is a cumulative enterprise. Of course it's a cumulative enterprise. Einstein doesn't abolish Newton. This world is still Newton. Bits and pieces of an atom or an infinite star are Einstein. It's a cumulative process. And that seems to me to be, again, one of the things that we need to be arguing, but it's the extraordinarily simple notion that a current nostrum is a universal solution. You look again when we encounter both our own, the past of our own society and other contemporary societies, we should be aware simply of human variety. We're reluctant to confront human variety. One of the reasons we're getting things so awfully wrong with what's going on with Russia and the Ukraine is that, again, our politicians spout to us. All the world thinks that Russia's wrong. Actually, all the world doesn't think that Russia's wrong. If you actually look at the G20...
Next question.
Okay, but just let me quickly make this point because it's absolutely central. Only, if you look at the G20, only 11 of the countries of the G20 have actually sanctioned Russia. We are a minority. We are different. It's important we recognize our difference, but we need equally to recognize the extraordinary different range of ideas, values, and whatever of other human societies, which is why Russia and China have played us for fools.
That's another whole subject we could how they're working together or not. But you've conjured up, David, something in my mind. You're talking about fertilising garden gnomes.
Terrible thought that terrible thought that gnomes will start to fructify and multiply, isn't it? Yeah. But you know what I mean. Yeah.
I do
the language occasionally gets too vivid. Yes.
But you reminded me there of something Jonathan Swift said, which was vision is the art of seeing the invisible.
Yeah.
Do you think that politicians at large, you were imploring us to write to our MPs, do you think that politicians at large today are as visionary as those of, let's say, 50 or 100 years ago?
I don't see, you see, somebody like Zelensky cuts through, because here is a man of passion, of force, of rhetorical power, who feels, directs, and can speak. We've heard nothing like this since Churchill. And if you look at Churchill, what is astonishing about Churchill, Churchill understands both the detail and the big picture. Churchill writes brilliantly on the nature of the English-speaking world. It's Churchill who is one of the pioneers of the notion of the special relationship, of the Anglo-American relationship, and so on. And of course, it's Churchill who writes with an astonishing self-awareness, I would even argue self-contempt, about what he was doing when he handed over Eastern Europe to Stalin. Do we not all realize this? We made Russia. The decisions of Yalta, the decisions of Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta are the final endorsement of the position of Russia as a dominant world power.
Would it be fair?
But we had to do it. So again, Churchill says all this. He understands why he had to do it, but he had to fight shit with shit. Yeah. He was fighting Hitler with the same means. But so we've all deliberately obscured this. The behavior of Russia, the behavior of Russian troops, as we've seen it in the Ukraine, is identical to what Eastern Europe endured in 1946, 45, 46, 47, in 56, in 68. We, particularly in those earlier 3 years, never talked about it because it was inconvenient, it was Uncle Joe, and they were our allies. We've deceived and lied to ourselves. Sorry?
Would it be fair to say, going back to Yalta, though, that Churchill was shattered, Roosevelt was dying, and Stalin was an opportunist?
Of course he was, but I mean, Churchill actually wasn't shattered. Churchill knew exactly what was happening, and again, I think much of the problem was Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt's idealism. The reason that we have China as a member of the Security Council is American idealism, undoubtedly. There was no reason to do it whatever in 1945. There was no way you could have avoided putting Russia on the Security Council. The other great catastrophe, in my view, is putting France on the Security Council. No, I'm being really serious. I don't hate France, but if you actually look at French behavior, it has been universally treacherous. It really, Macron is absolutely in the succession of de Gaulle. And again, all those of you who may be thinking what I said about the EU was disgraceful, can I please recommend you look at my YouTube video on the origins of the EU. The EU was deliberately conceived to exclude England. Absolutely deliberately. The famous declaration of 6th of May 1950, was deliberately designed to exclude England. It was even more interestingly deliberately designed to exclude democracy. Right back at the beginning there. It's a profoundly awkward and difficult document. But Churchill is the last politician in Britain. Thatcher to a certain extent. But Churchill, again, because he's a historian. Churchill is a serious historian. Churchill learned to be again, not so much my YouTube, but look at that series on the Churchills, which I did on Channel 4. Come on Channel 4 about 10 years.
Channel 4?
Well, we'll come back to but just one second. But just 1 second. Let me finish that. In that series on Channel 4, Churchill learns to be a politician as a historian. He learns how to run a team when he's writing his great biography of Marlborough, which at the time was the book that received the world's largest advance. He was paid the equivalent of, at that point, our Prime Minister was very well paid. He was paid the equivalent of 4 times the Prime Minister's annual salary as an advance for Marlborough. And he assembles a team, and he learns how to use them at Chartwell. And if you actually look at how he used them, and indeed there's a great overlap between the person, Maurice Ashley and people like that. There's a considerable overlap between the people who are involved and the inner circle that he assembled around himself in the Second World War. He actually learns, as it were, to do history by writing about history.
We've discussed that at length before, but let's move on to Jeff and then to Christian. The two there. Jeff.
David, I'm Jeff.
Yeah,
I've listened with fascination to everything you've said. I want to ask you a question which has some scope to your breadth of knowledge. Where in the scale of sheer crackpottedness does Putin's launch of an unwinnable war in Ukraine stand in recent history?
And let's take Christian next. Where's Christian?
Is Russia's love of the strongman leader model really a cry for the return to the Tsars? Should we work for the return of that model to government?
Well, I think, if I may answer for A first, I think that Putin is exactly about the return of Tsarism. It's been on the cards ever since communism fell. The first thing that Yeltsin did when he became, was he premier, whatever his title was he president in Russia? The first thing that he did was to knock down inside the Kremlin the chamber of the Supreme Soviets and to rebuild St. George's Hall, which is this gigantic czarist structure, which is the favorite space in which Putin shows himself. In other words, again, Starkey's law of revolutions is that revolutions merely perpetuate the worst features of the ancien regime. Russia has remained an empire. It's remained a tsardom. The members of the Tsarist secret police simply changed their uniforms to become members of Cheka. That was all that happened. Neither under the Tsars nor under Stalin nor under any of his successors was there ever a proper system of representative government. Was there any notion of fixed law? Was there any notion of genuine human rights? And by the way, can I just say, this is something we have forgotten, and it is absolutely essential. Russia managed to pervert the structures of the United Nations, as we're now understanding. But Russia is also responsible, and I'm going to be writing about this a lot, of perverting the structures of human rights laws to turn them from the protection of the individual against the state into the notion that the individual should be restricted in favor of special general rights like race, class, gender, whatever. Russia perverts human rights laws brilliantly throughout the whole of the 30 or 40 years after the enactment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what we've done, we have all slept Our diplomats have absolutely slipped on this. So, right. So, Russia is naturally... Russia has never known freedom. Russia has no natural frontiers. Putin simply sees himself in the footsteps. Do we all realize Ivan the Terrible and Henry VIII are semi-contemporaries? The reason they have this completely different impact, again, I've done a program on this on my YouTube channel. The reason they have a completely different impact is England had fixed frontiers from the Norman conquest and before, and it had stable institutions. Russia has never had stable institutions. It's never had stable frontiers. It also has a completely different kind of church, which is simply following the Byzantine model. The patriarch is at the foot of the Tsar. There's no Beckett in Russia. There is not even a Cranmer. So, but finally, coming back to your unwinnable war,
has Putin already won anyway?
I think Putin has won, but that's another matter. But just coming back to the question, and clearly, what you've got to remember is that Putin has been absolutely without limitation in what he's done, his behavior in Syria, his behavior in every kind of marginal frontier situation within Russia itself, the seizure of the Crimea, the seizure of Donbass and whatever, all of them worked without a single peep from the West. Right. Now, clearly, the taking on of the whole Ukraine and the revelation of the sheer clumsiness of the Russian military machine and so on, the assumption, by the way, that Russia would be received in the Ukraine rather as we imagined we would be received in Iraq. Do you remember? You all thought there was going to be trumpets would sound and hail the liberator. And by the way, can I remind everybody that the Attorney General at the time of Blair's invasion of Iraq, ruled in a fashion which I'm absolutely sure Putin got, that his position, Britain's position as a member of the United Nations Security Council with a veto, meant there would never be any question of a war crimes trial. Blair actually asks that question with the invasion of Iraq. So I think that it was a characteristic piece of overreach, but finally, can I just remind everybody, Putin has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. He will not hesitate to use it. I'm sorry, we really do need to remember this. All this talk about putting Putin on trial, if it actually came to real defeat, don't we all realize that a man of his pride, of his arrogance, would do exactly what Hitler tried to do in 1945? The only reason the Second World War did not end in a universal Holocaust was that Hitler did not have an atom bomb. Hitler would have brought about a universal Goethe-Dammerung if he had had an atom bomb. And when everybody goes on about putting Putin on trial and whatever, it is fatuous, it is foolish, it is dangerous. Only somebody in the mental state of Biden can be excused for doing it. Now, I'm really we giggle, but it's not giggleable. Russia has said quite clearly that London will be the first in line. Do we all know this?
Yes.
Do we all know this? They've repeated several. I'm sorry, I believe them.
But if I wind the clock back, you mentioned Hitler.
Yeah.
There were several attempts. One was July 1944,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
Yeah, but see, Germany's different. Germany is different. There was an independent aristocracy. If you look at those who were involved in that plan, in the plot, these were members of the old Prussian aristocracy. These were people with a certain sense of the dignity of the appropriate what's the word I want? Code of arms.
So you don't think there's any threat
There's
to
no,
music from inside?
well, there might be, but it's nothing like that. Can we all just register what has happened in Russia? There was an aristocracy in Russia. It was deliberately exterminated. Can we not understand what communism does? It deliberately destroys civil society. Why, for example, has somewhere like Spain so quickly recovered from Franco? We are all told, isn't fascism wicked? Fascism on the whole, why did Germany recover so quickly from Hitler? Because fascism on the whole does not destroy civil society. It does not destroy the professions, it doesn't destroy the church, it doesn't destroy industrial corporations. It co-opts them, it corrupts them, but it doesn't destroy them. Communism destroys them. And this is why it's infinitely harder to recover from decades and decades of communism than it is. And you know, Russia, I'm sorry, like China, it's the heir to the deliberate... So again, we must understand, it's the heir to the deliberate destruction of value.
And if I can pick you up on China there, you said just now about diplomats sleeping. If we think back to 1949, when the Communist Party as it is now, when China came to power, and then look to, was it April 55, Germany joined NATO, and the Soviet Union was formalised, and Churchill came up with the Iron Curtain expression. China repeated then what they said in 49, we're in no hurry, we're going to rule the world, we don't intend to fire very many bullets, if any, and I believe today they own 85% of the Earth's rare minerals. That gives them control. Diplomats sleeping, have we just sleepwalked into this and let it happen?
I think the real problem is essentially what happened after 1989. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, with fools like Fukuyama writing about the end of history, we all persuaded ourselves that the Western model was going to win without a struggle. That essentially so it goes back to the point that I was making about recognizing human difference. We thought everybody wanted to be like us, that the ambition of the world was to be like Utah. Everybody really wanted to belong to the American Midwest. They all wanted to go to, you know, McDonald's. They all wanted to wear cowboy hats and Levi jeans, and you know, the girls wanted to go around in rah-rah skirts. Do you remember we fought a war in Iraq? A war in Afghanistan so that women could wear miniskirts? That was actually advanced as one of the things we were doing. And that's what went wrong. We imagined that the world wanted to be Western. We then made the catastrophic errors of admitting first China and then Russia to the World Trade Organization. China in 2001, Russia in 2012, on the assumption that if we allowed them to have free trade with us, they would become like us. Whereas, in fact, all they've done is to use free trade to develop and strengthen their own political system. What else would you want to? What else would an intelligent person have expected them to do?
And China told us they were going to do it.
Of course. But it's true. It's true. There's just been but it's a product of arrogance. It's a product of arrogance, self-centeredness, and the refusal to recognize. I mean, you know, we have Father Hill here, and Christ, as always, is extremely shrewd on these things. Man shall not live by bread alone. People don't simply exist to trade. They don't simply exist to be prosperous. They have different views. Say nothing of women. They have different views of how mankind and womankind and childkind and transkind should operate. And you know, we, again, because of our self-centeredness, of our lack of imagination, of our lack of breadth. But I think the fatal mistakes, and you can see this, do we all again realize the line that China is taking at the moment? There's this campaign now, very understandable, in view of the horror of what Russia has been exposed, what Russian troops have been exposed to be doing. In the Ukraine, there's this clamour to exclude Russia from international organisations. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no machinery to do so. There is no machinery to do so. There is no means by which you can get rid of a veto-wielding member of the Security Council from the United Nations. There is no means by which a member of the G20 can be excluded. Indonesia, by the way, yet another one of these 9 out of the 20 states of the G20, which is the host of the next G20 meeting, has made absolutely clear Putin will be invited. China has said quite clearly that economic sanctions are totally inappropriate because they interfere with the world economy, which has got nothing to do with politics. Isn't that convenient? Isn't that really convenient?
We could speculate on whether Putin would go, but we haven't got time, so we're coming to
question about the
Soviet Union. Yeah, you had your question at the beginning, so we're going to stick, because we've gone 3 o'clock. I'm actually going to use a bit of privilege here and ask you to comment on something you said 2 years ago, which was reported in the Times, and ask you if you think anything has changed. David Starkey sticks his neck out.
Never.
The Johnson Downing Street resembles the court of Henry VIII, says historian David Starkey, who compares Carrie Johnson to Anne Boleyn. The Tudor Queen, Starkey said at the London Grill Club, made the transition from mistress to wife, and then began to bump off her enemies and elevate her friends. You ended, one only hopes it ends the same way. Where are we now on that? We've had a few books on Carrie since, haven't we?
I think, unfortunately, my prophecy has yet failed to come completely true.
So you live in hope?
I think that there will not be a serious Conservative government until Boris has another divorce.
And will he stay? Or will he throw the woman out, as it were?
I'm being very serious. It seems to me that what she represents is that eco-green conservatism, which the events of the last few weeks have demonstrated is the merest self-indulgence.
We'll stop that there and take the last question, which is from Richard. And the Times aren't here to cover that.
David, who is your favourite historian and why?
Myself.
You are allowed. We'd rather guess you'd say that, and it's allowed.
No. I suppose my favourite, in most ways, my favourite historians are the practical historians. They are Clarendon, they are Churchill, they are the Greeks, all of whom were practical men of business and politicians. Because it seems to me, so this is coming back to another question, should I be doing something myself? History is properly a practical subject. It is the central, is and should be the central training ground for those who are to be involved in public affairs. And I think the people who have demonstrated, I've referred to them, the Macaulays, the Churchills, the Clarendons. Gibbon's a bit of an example. He's never particularly active politically, but he displays much of that same quality of mind. The great historians are the ones who handle a dialogue of past and present, who use the past to illuminate the present and the present to illuminate the past. There are very, very great and very distinguished academic historians, and I was immensely privileged to be taught by several of them. But that's a different category. The people who stand out as the voices of Clio, the voices of the muse of history, are those who bestride times, who talk, as I said, with the authority of the past into the present and with the illumination of the present into the past. And it's what, again, is astonishing about Zelensky's addresses to the various assemblies in the world, the various parliamentary assemblies. He has displayed an astonishing talent. Here is this man, you know, he's a comedian, this astonishing talent on every occasion, with Israel, with France, with Britain, with Germany, with America, to pick on salient features of the past of that country and to turn them back on them and to force them to reflect upon themselves. That is the proper task of the historian. And so, in other words, what I'm really saying, and it's odd, isn't it? The task of the historian is essentially prophetic. You are both explaining the past and you're a kind of Cassandra. We all know what happens to Cassandra, she's ignored. But that's what you're doing.
I think most of us would think first of Churchill as a politician rather than as a historian, although accepting that.
No. Churchill. No. Churchill sees what he was. What Churchill did. Remember, Churchill says, "I'm confident about the verdict of history because I will write it." Right through the Second World War, Churchill is consciously accumulating the materials for the history of the Second World War.
And there are people who accuse him of distorting.
Indeed. But I mean, what he did was completely wonderful. He copies the housekeeper at Chartwell Inn to every top secret document.
Boris does that by leaving the box open.
Well, I think Boris does it simply by reading them with his wife, but that's another matter. By the way, the much better name for her than Carrie Antoinette is Canny Boleyn. I think Canny Boleyn gets it absolutely.
She almost sounds Scottish when you say that.
Yes.
But I was going to lead on to say that you mentioned Churchill there as an historian. And I wonder, ladies and gentlemen, have we witnessed today an historian launching his political?
I'm a bit old.
No. Look at Biden. No. You're not much older than me. With the birth of a new movement, which you will lead us out of these dark days of wokeism and cancellism. Yeah, I mean, I think that people would take to you. Are you saying Nigel Farage could do something you couldn't?
Probably.
I'm not. Well, we can't end on that. Ladies and gentlemen, what a presentation. Yes. Pearls of wisdom. David Starkey.
Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase T-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.